Day 30, Quebec City. I woke up early, excited to be in my favorite city in Canada. I'd yet to create a morning routine here, but first I had to use the washroom, otherwise I would die. After driving around with turmoil in my bladder, I found a nearby park that had a porta potty that I could use anytime. After finding relief, I set off to see if I could find a place to shower. While I was used to using Huggies' kindertucher method of cleansing myself, I always preferred to take a normal shower whenever possible. I found a Petro Pass truck stop a quick 15-minute drive away on Avenue Felix Leclerc that had showers for non-truckers. After having an adventure with my broken French, I was able to bathe myself properly. The heat of summer had arrived long ago, and along with it the humidity along the cities dotting the St. Lawrence River. It was nice to be able to start the day clean and fresh. From there, I decided it was time to visit downtown Old Quebec. I found myself driving scenic streets of Quebec City as Avenue Bourassa and Boulevard Laurier until I found a famous street that led to Old Quebec, Grande Allee. I parked across the plains of Abraham and wandered through Old Quebec with curiosity and splendor. The last time I was here in this city I was merely a child, and I remember feeling like I was in a completely different place. The sights, the sounds, and the surroundings of Old Quebec, it was like a European jewel in Canada. As I walked through Old Quebec, I came across numerous monuments and statues commemorating historic figures and events that unfolded in Quebec's past. I wasn't surprised, as after all, this was the capital of Quebec. Unlike most capital cities in Canada, Quebec's legislative buildings and government offices had Christian decor. This signified the strong ties between the government and the Christian faith. The architecture of the buildings was also something that looked like nothing else I've seen in Canada. Almost everything looked like a fortress design from the 18th century. Quebec City was also very clean, unlike its larger sister city, Montreal, which was absolutely filthy. Eventually, I came across the Parliament building. With the exception of the nation's capital, the Parliament building in Quebec City was by far the most beautifully decorated of all legislative buildings I've been to in Canada. The architecture was designed in a Renaissance style opposite to the British style found in Ottawa. Monuments and statues abound throughout the grounds of the Parliament building. Of course, everything that played a role in the formation of Quebec. Unsurprisingly, I did not find any Canadian flags here, only flags that bearing the fleur de lis. I wondered if it was offensive to the Quebecois for me to be walking around with a red cowboy hat and a Canadian flag. No matter, I did so anyways without any fear. The gardens surrounding the grounds of the Parliament building were immaculate as I expected them to be, but also quite colorful as well. Blue and white, like the fleur de lis, were the main colors, although yellow and red were seen as well. Every city and every province has pride in itself, but it was different here in Quebec. As the Quebecois were first and foremost, they didn't think of themselves as Canadians. They were Quebecois. The pride in Quebec was seen throughout Old Quebec as I was immersed in history that I myself knew nothing about. Continuing east, I found myself at the St. Louis Gate, one of the 4 remaining city gates of Old Quebec. Walking through the gates of this historic entry point into Old Quebec was like stepping back in time. As I continued down Rue Saint Louis towards Chateau Frontenac, the architecture of the buildings were even older than I remembered them to be. The buildings were beautiful of an era long past, but iconic nevertheless. I myself was not the only one mesmerized by Old Quebec, as I seen many other travelers taking pictures and videos of this scenic area. It was great to see that despite travel restrictions, people were still enjoying themselves exploring the wonders of this great nation. I did come across something of an era that should have been left in the dust, however. I was surprised to see an art store that still used the word Eskimo. I remember growing up and using that word to describe the Inuit people of the North, only to discover some time later that it was a derogatory and racist slur. It was surprising that the Quebecois were still allowed to use this word. As I neared the landmark Chateau Frontenac in the distance, I came across another government building, the Ministry of Finance. The first thing on my mind was how beautifully decorated this building was, with all the designs on the stone that were made in such intricate detail. But knowing that this was the Ministry of Finance in the most corrupt province of Canada, I could only imagine how much wealth was hidden inside its walls and down in the dungeon. I'd finally arrived at Chateau Frontenac with the monument of Samuel de Champlain. While all of Old Quebec City was photo-worthy, this was a spot most commonly known around the world. I walked up to the guardrail overlooking the St. Lawrence River and the lower portion of Old Quebec City. This was also another cool area I knew I was going to explore later in the day. There was something just beautiful and peaceful about being by the water, something that only someone who grew up by the ocean could ever understand. I looked back at the iconic Chateau Frontenac towering above and looking out towards the water and beyond. However, I turned back slightly and explored the area Rue du Trésor. This was a cool little street with street vendors showcasing their crafts. Paintings, pottery, artwork, and more were available here. Many Canadians would argue as to which province produces the best art, but for me, Quebec is the real winner. I made my way to City Hall of Quebec City, where I was surrounded by more beautiful architecture, reminding me of Europe. While it was relatively busy, considering the rest of the country was in lockdown, it seemed as if Quebec City took this opportunity to make improvements to their iconic city. Signs of construction were evident everywhere. Unlike its more popular sister city of Montreal, where it seemed like the city workers took the lockdown as an opportunity not to show up for work. Also, like Montreal, there was a Place des Armées, where people gathered to enjoy themselves in this historic city. I wandered off and found myself in Rue Saint Anne, another cool street with cool European flair. From there, I also found myself on Rue Saint Jean, where I enjoyed the scenery before deciding to head back towards Chateau Frontenac. I could only imagine how busy this would have been were it not for the restrictions in place, and like many other cities I visited earlier, it was great to see people enjoying themselves. Unlike the strange feeling of emptiness back in Victoria, which was a ghost town when I left nearly a month ago, the streets were a mix of asphalt and rectangular bricks. Despite these bricks, they're much easier to walk on than the horrible cobblestone roads in Germany and Denmark I walked on just a few years ago. Continuing onwards, just outside City Hall of Quebec City, I came across a UNESCO marker. Although I wasn't a resident of Quebec and I'm certainly not French, I felt pride in knowing that the world recognizes my favorite Canadian city. Just outside the Notre Dame de Quebec Basilica was a monument of Cardinal Taschereau. I know nothing about the Catholic faith here in Quebec, but everything I've seen, the Catholic faith had been deeply ingrained in the history of this province. I was reaching a point of mental saturation with all the wonderful sights around me, and at the same time the bloody temperature was rising rapidly. I knew that if I headed down towards the water, it would be much cooler there. I walked by the St. Louis St. Laurent building, and in front of it was the St. Francois de Laval monument. The entire area was well groomed, very clean, similar to that of Ottawa. Before heading down, I was able to enjoy taking pictures of more statues of popular names I've heard of before, as well as sites of cannons aimed towards the water. Here was Montmorency Park, and while I was here, I did notice a tour guide in a period costume. I could have only imagined how brutally hot his costume was. Here I was just about ready to rip off my clothes due to the horrible heat and humidity, and someone was walking around in period garb. Looking back at Chateau Frontenac, I quickly changed my mind, so I continued to take photos of other important figures in Quebec history before heading back up to the Dufferin Terrace. The Dufferin Terrace is a promenade that runs along the cliff overlooking the St. Lawrence River and the lower level of Quebec City. The views at this elevation were stunning in all directions. Across the St. Lawrence River was Lévis, Quebec. While the sky was a mix of sun and cloud, it was getting very hot. I walked by the Chateau Frontenac on the east side adjacent to the Dufferin Terrace, and like many people around this famous point in Quebec, I took many photos. The architecture, alongside with the architecture found all around Quebec City, was like taking a trip back to Europe. Seeing that I was just east of the Plains of Abraham, I came across several monuments commemorating the battles that were fought here. Unfortunately, growing up in Nova Scotia, we were not taught the history of Quebec at the time. Ironically, we were taught to speak Acadian. At the south end of the Dufferin Terrace was the Governor's Walkway, 310 steps leading up to the Plains of Abraham. I climbed the steps, which were not difficult at all, but the heat led me to feel fatigued throughout the process. Again, I enjoyed the view across the St. Lawrence and into Lévis. There were numerous landings along the Governor's Walkway for people to sit and enjoy the scenery, or like me, to catch my breath in this torrid heat. At the top, I reached the Viewpoint St. Laurent, a circular enclosure that views across the Plains of Abraham to Lévis to the entire surrounding area. How beautiful of a city Quebec City was. As much as I was enjoying myself, I was hating the heat and humidity. Since my arrival in Toronto a few weeks ago, I was shirtless every single day, and today was no different. I rested in the shade of this canopy before following the many paths along the Plains of Abraham. There were a number of interesting sites scattered throughout the Plains of Abraham, mostly bilingual and some strangely in English. Along the Parc des Champs de Bataille, I found the Citadelle de Quebec, home of the Vendus, also known as the Royal 22nd Regiment. I felt the same feeling I felt when visiting the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa just weeks earlier. How my life would have been different if I joined the military. It was something that was on the back of my mind, something that had been brewing in me for so long. I felt a deep sense of respect for the storied regiment with such a long history, with many battles fought since its formation just before Canada became a country. I didn't enter the Citadelle de Quebec, although there were many tours available. One of the interesting things about Quebec as a province is that every single day I always came across an interesting character. I saw a homeless person on the Plains of Abraham searching a gully for recyclables. He ended up getting stung by a bee or a wasp, and then started shouting as he clambered back up to the street. Then he rode his skateboard away while I laughed. Only in the province of Quebec do you find such characters. I headed back to Chateau Frontenac, walking along the numerous paths leading in different directions. While looking to the west, I could see the modern buildings of Quebec City in the distance. I purposely stayed here in Old Quebec for its history and nostalgia. I arrived at Chateau Frontenac through Rue de Carrières on the south entrance. As I walked through the courtyard, I was astounded by how many people were staying in this hotel. It was endlessly busy, and it seemed like there was a lineup for people to check into the lobby. Chateau Frontenac was as beautiful on the interior courtyard as it was on the exterior side, facing the St. Lawrence River. While a little rich on my taste, especially considering I have been car camping since my first day in Lumbee nearly a month ago, I knew I would not be staying at the Chateau Frontenac anytime soon. I still had a strong appreciation for its splendid architecture, however. Just outside the Chateau Frontenac, I found more interesting sculptures, and by now it was getting even busier. Tour buses arrived, more Quebecois artists were performing music or dances, and tourists were taking selfies with any available spot. Again, I looked towards the monument of Samuel de Champlain as if he beckoned me to visit other parts of Old Quebec City. So I spent a few moments looking at different places on my Google Maps to see, and by now I was starting to get hungry. While I did enjoy Chinese food in Toronto, nothing in Ottawa, and sushi in Montreal, for some reason I didn't feel like having a true Quebecois meal here in Quebec City. I just wanted something cool, refreshing, and easy as my senses led me to different directions. I wandered aimlessly in search for a decent place for lunch, coming across even more unusual and strange artworks on display. If British Columbia is known for its world-class marijuana, then Quebec is known for its world-class maple syrup. Some artists were definitely on a sugar high when creating these art forms. I followed some crowds which led me to different streets with different scenes. Since this was high noon, everyone was out enjoying themselves. I passed through St. John's Gate, one of the four remaining city gates of Old Quebec City. Just west of St. John's Gate was Place Dieuville, which was strangely a beach setting, just outside the historic center of Quebec City. While technically outside the historic center, the architecture of the buildings here was still absolutely beautiful, with designs not commonly found anywhere else in Canada. I continued walking west down Rue Saint Jean, which began to look more modern than historic. I came across another beautiful church, the Église de Saint Jean Baptiste, founded in 1882 while Canada was still in its infancy and still had a presence in modern-day Quebec City. As I ventured off into the modern area, I found myself at the crossroads and decided to head back to my beast. Feeling fatigued from the heat and knowing that I had plenty to drink plus some food in my vehicle, I headed back to my parking spot. Along the way, I found some interesting things, as I always do in every city that I visit. Some strong anti-fascist remarks written on a rubbish can, the word penis scratched onto a footpath, and 3 little concrete characters discussing the best way to separate from Canada while maintaining all the financial benefits. I reached Grand Allee, found my beast, and rested. I decided I would walk around the plains of Abraham a little. After being in an urban yet delightful area, it would be nice to walk around beautiful gardens and get some shade. I walked around the Jeanne d'Arc garden, which was well manicured and maintained. While not nearly as pristine and perfect as something I would find in Ottawa, it was still nice to see and be able to enjoy the green scenery while hopelessly avoiding the heat. In the Joan of Arc garden, there was a statue of Joan of Arc herself, riding a horse with her sword raised as if charging into battle. While I was vaguely familiar with the story, I wasn't quite sure why a statue of Joan of Arc would be here in Canada, or at least in Quebec City. I didn't care so much as the history, though, as it was just nice to be out in the screen space for a while. I continued walking through the plains of Abraham, noticing the Martello Tower in the distance, but I thought it would be something that I would revisit some other time. Since my parking meter was already up, I thought it would be great to visit the lower section of Old Quebec City and see some interesting things, see what I could find and what colorful characters I would come across. I went back to my beast, drove down, and parked across from Place Jean Pelletier and started exploring the area. I walked eastwards towards the area known as Quartier Petit Champlain. Before reaching Quartier Petit Champlain, I definitely came across some unusual artwork. While there were some beautiful fountains giving off cool mist in this heat, there were also some stainless steel chairs with cryptic inscriptions as well. Some of these chairs did have some engravings that were somewhat understandable. Either way, artwork was everywhere here in Quebec City. Colorful shops, trendy restaurants, and a mix of old architecture were in all directions here, just like on the upper section of Old Quebec City. However, given this area was less pedestrian friendly, it was also much busier with car traffic. Numerous statues of women were here as well, signifying the equality amongst the 2 genders that the Quebecois women celebrate. And naturally, it would not be Quebec City without some plaque commemorating a battle. Walking in the alleys led to more old world architecture as well as some of the most photographed places in Quebec City. The famous Quebec City mural was one of them. How fortunate I was to be able to be here in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic, driving across the country in the middle of the summer and experiencing Quebec history. The lifelike mural was created in such a way that from a distance it would seem as if the visitor was viewing a scene from another time. En français, it was named La Fresque des Québécois, and it had depictions of real-life people portrayed throughout the portrait. Continuing along Rue Notre Dame, I found myself at Place Royale, which was one of the most famous and photographed areas of Old Quebec City. Across from Place Royale was the Notre Dame des Victoires, also one of the most famous churches. Here in Place Royale, I found several guided tour groups similar to the ones I found in various cities throughout Europe that I visited in the past. Just off Place Royale were some other interesting sites. A set of steep stairs leading towards the upper portion of Old Quebec City with motivational writing on one of them. But some strange oddities as well, such as a girl on a swing suspended high above the ground. I found this quite creepy, even for an odd fellow such as myself. Some things here in Quebec City were definitely not things I would define as family friendly, but I suppose that's just coming from an Anglophone perspective. Notre Dame de Victoire had tours available, but I wasn't really interested in entering museums or other buildings at the moment. Despite the heat and humidity, I wanted to remain outdoors. I continued exploring, heading south where I'd seen the funicular in the distance. Along the way, I'd seen people's clothing suspended high above, similar to the young girl on the swing earlier. I could not imagine what was going through the people's minds when they created this. I just knew their blood sugar level was way too high with all the maple syrup they consumed, and with everything else, it would not be French if there were no overturned cars. Thankfully, unlike Paris and the residents of Quebec City do not light everything up on fire. Cars were overturned, and it would be the Quebecois rite of passage to jump around on these overturned vehicles. While I did consider doing so myself, I passed on the opportunity. I headed down Rue Petit Champlain, admiring more colorful shops and restaurants along the busy alley, noting that the Dufferin Terrace was just above me. As I was nearing the end, I came across the famous Fresque de Petit Champlain. This too was an interesting mural depicting old life in Old Quebec City from days past. The Quebecois were and still are people who experienced some hardships in establishing themselves and had a strong pioneering spirit. I headed back north to Rue Petit Champlain, wanting to walk on the promenade by the St. Lawrence River. Along the way, I did see some interesting restaurants with animal mascots by their entrance. Some of these restaurants were famous for serving traditional French cuisine that could not be found outside of Quebec, for reasons ranging from unethical to unusual. I seen another set of steep stairs, the Escalier Casse-Cou, famous for being the breakneck steps. Perhaps this drew inspiration from the original Exorcist film. After all, many ghosts abound Quebec City. I didn't take the steps myself as I wasn't planning on heading back up to the upper level of Old Quebec City. I continued onwards, passing by numerous shops that offered fur clothing. Fur has for centuries been a part of Canadian culture and remains a luxury item, mainly accepted in French and First Nations culture. Many Canadians would find such clothing archaic and even offensive. For me, I found it interesting, although I own no fur clothing myself. I headed towards the promenade as the sun began to set, and thankfully the temperature lowered slightly. While each city I'd visited had different types of artwork, such as Toronto's art scene, Ottawa's political scene, Montreal's archaic scene, Quebec was steeped in historic art. However, sometimes I would find some random artwork that seemed to have no meaning at all, at least not for me, as I've never been an artist myself. I arrived in Place des Canotiers, right across the water, where I noticed a group of people coming together at the Parc des Vieux-Port. It appeared to be some sort of indie music performance. The sun was slowly starting to set. It was a beautiful scene to be part of. I sat down and I enjoyed the performance from various artists. I looked around and took time to immerse myself in this lovely scene. Here I was on my first day of being in Quebec City, wandering through the streets and exploring the nearly countless things to see. In all my excitement, I was taking pictures, visiting places, and while memorable, I didn't truly get to connect with the city until now. Although I was only by myself, I felt like I was part of the group here. I looked around, people enjoying themselves as part of an audience to these musicians. These musicians grateful for the opportunity to perform for an audience. Everyone coming together during a time of restriction and near anarchy, yet there was a sign of peace here. Again, I was looking around. People were coming together in unity. And in a province known as being separatist, troublemaking, and problematic, I found peace here that I didn't find in the other provinces thus far. The music was so peaceful, the performance was so natural, and everything felt surreal. I spent the entire day walking around and trying to see everything that I almost forgot that I had no responsibilities, no restrictions. Here, amongst a group of strangers, I felt free. As the sun disappeared and night set in, I decided to retrace my steps. I headed back to Quartier Petit Champlain, admiring more artwork that I didn't see during the daytime. Quebec City was truly an artistic paradise. I did find some random stupid ass graffiti, but that was just a given in any urban setting. At night, Quebec City was truly magnificent, much more than any of the major cities I have visited throughout this trip. Unsurprisingly, Old Quebec City became busier in the evening than during the daytime. However, it was a much more different crowd now. Long gone were the tour guides speaking in different languages or the tourists flocking to see everything there was to see. Now it seemed like the locals came out to enjoy themselves. During the day, with all the tourists, it was normal to hear different languages spoken aside from Francais. English, German, Korean, Chinese, and more. Now the tourists have all left and the locals come out and the only language spoken was Francais. I went up the Escalier Cascou and it really was as steep as I thought. It definitely would have been bad if I did fall down one of these steps. Thankfully, there were landings between, otherwise it would have been a featurette on Just for Laughs. Although a victim would not be laughing if they were alive at all. I arrived at the top of Chateau Frontenac shortly after, all lit up in its glory. A crowd had surrounded the monument of Samuel de Champlain, and I was curious as to why. There was a loudspeaker in the background and people with their cameras out. It appeared that there were a number of former Cirque du Soleil performers here. They explained that their employment was terminated due to the COVID-19 pandemic and they're finding ways to support themselves during this time of economic hardship. Unfortunately, I only caught the end of the performance, but I knew I would return here again. I walked the same way that I walked hours earlier along Dufferin Terrace, overlooking the lower section of Old Quebec City, and over into Lévis, which was just as beautiful in the darkness as it was during the day. As I walked away from Chateau Frontenac and towards Governor's Walkway, I decided to turn around. The crowds had dispersed from this area and I wanted to revisit Place Dieuville. I made my way to the areas now familiar with me, as they were no less delightful than they were earlier. It almost seemed nicer to explore during the evening, avoiding the crowd of tourists and the somewhat cooler weather. Rue Saint Jean was lit up and many of the shops and restaurants were still open. I arrived at the Saint Jean gate, greeted by more musicians who were happy to play for the crowd. As I walked past the gate into Place Dieuville, I took in all the sights around me and basked in all of Old Quebec City's glory. However, I grew tired as I spent the entire day walking. Trudgingly, I walked back to my beast, headed back to my car camping spot for the night. Despite a long day filled with excitement, I fell asleep quickly and easily. Tomorrow would be another wonderful day, as I already had some new places to explore.
Subscribe to the Travel Experience de Voyage channel. Tap the bell and join the conversation on the comment section below.